All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. We have another special interview and special guest returning, Dr. Graham Oppy. Dr. Oppy, thanks for coming back on, especially since it's a little bit later in the day for you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
All right. So today we're going to be talking about a good number of things, but the broad topic is God and explanation, theism and explanation. We're going to be looking at preferred worldviews, so theism versus naturalism, the best theistic versus best atheistic worldviews, and seeing how they compare up on explaining the data. So we're going to talk a little bit about what explanation is, different accounts of it briefly, and then we'll go through certain arguments and certain concepts at work in those arguments, and perhaps just some data that needs to be explained, and we'll talk a little bit about what the relevant data is. It's going to be broadly following the same outline as Dr. Oppy's book here, The Best Argument Against God, setting up the models, comparing them on data, and seeing which one comes out on top in the end. So, of course, spoiler alert, I've read the book. Dr. Oppy prefers naturalism as an explanation, so we're going to go through as to why here. So, to start off, let's talk about what are theories themselves in philosophy. So, here we're comparing theories about, say, the worldviews, or if you want to call it global causal reality, or just our general frameworks for thinking about and explaining data. So when we talk about, a theory explaining something, so like naturalism as a theory to explain reality, what does that mean, especially in philosophy? And does it differ, and how does it differ, if at all, from a theory in science? Maybe there's some overlap, maybe they work similarly. So yeah, I don't know if you want to start off talking a little bit about that. What are theories in philosophy?
Yeah. So I think of theories as just sets of claims. What's distinctive about a theory is that anything that's a logical consequence of stuff in the theory also belongs to the theory. So the way that people say it, theories are closed under logical consequence. And typically we suppose the logic in question is classical logic just because it's easier to work with, especially for non-logicians, than other logics. Yeah. But if you look at contemporary philosophy of religion, there's only a small corner of it where there are people working with logics other than classical logic. Okay, now a theory can be in a specific domain, so you could have a theory about gravitation, for example, or it could be very general. It could be in the physicist's sense, a theory of everything, or in the philosopher's sense, in which case it would be like an account of an entire possible world. That would be a theory that just had absolutely every single true claim in it. Obviously, we don't aim for constructing theories like that. It would be impossible for us to do it. And when I'm talking about a worldview, my kind of ideal worldview is that, a sort of total theory of everything. But in practice, your worldview is going to be minimally a kind of list of the big claims that you're committed to, which will include kind of big philosophical claims, but will include lots of other stuff as well.
Okay, that's a good start. So what's the relevant way in which, you might have covered it already, but so like a theory in philosophy, and then people say like a theory in science, and we talk about those, what's the main relevant difference then? Just the scope?
And subject matter. So you might have some domain in the physical world that you want to construct a theory about. It might be something like gravitation or electromagnetism, but it might be something much more local than that. Whereas philosophers will want to include a lot of stuff that nobody else is interested in. That's the wrong way to say it. That nobody else wants to talk about when they've got their professional hat on, right? And most people are interested in the question whether there's an afterlife or whether God exists or whatever, but philosophers tend to be the people who talk about those kinds of issues. And part of the reason for that is because I think that in the sciences, we've got some idea about methods that work, and we've got some sort of central set of claims on which everyone agrees. People know that, like if you're a physicist and you're interested in mechanics, you know that there's this big domain where you can just use classical mechanics and it will give you results that are sufficiently accurate for any purposes that you might have. Whereas in philosophy, there's nothing like that. Philosophers disagree about everything, and we don't even agree on the methods that we can use. Some people think there are a priori methods having to do with intuition. Other people think there's no such thing, and so on, right across the board. So the difference, but that's where I think the difference between philosophy and the sciences lies. It's just that there's expert consensus sort of on a core of claims in the sciences, and then there's this kind of penumbra where people are agreed what the methods are, but we haven't quite figured out, we haven't finished the examination, so we don't know what the true claims are. And then as you kind of move a bit further out, it starts to shade into these grey areas where we don't know if these are questions that are answerable with the methods or not, and then we're sort of sliding into philosophy at that point. So that every discipline has its philosophy, according to me, and that's kind of where it sits. And then there's all this stuff that's just resolutely philosophical. There's questions about normativity. We haven't really made much progress on that in the last 3,000 years.
You're right. Still at the same starting point. Yeah, that maybe branching out of that, philosophers don't even agree necessarily on what philosophy is or what it's supposed to do, whereas with science we seem to have a general idea of like agreeing on what it's supposed to be and do.
Well, indeed, the account that I just gave you of philosophy is one that, for example, David Chalmers has a recent paper on what is philosophy, and he dismisses the view that I just gave you as being clearly incorrect, right? So that's just that's just the nature of the discipline. Pick anything and get us talking about it, and we'll find things to disagree about.
Right. Even the field itself, that's always funny. Philosophers will agree that philosophy is important, but they won't even agree on what philosophy is. So it's such an interesting field. Gotta love it. All right. So we talked a little bit about theories and how they are different in philosophy. So then let's talk a little bit about what are theoretical virtues. So when we're comparing two theories, say we've got naturalism and theism, every theory is going to have some good things about it and some costs. Probably nothing's going to be perfectly airtight. So what makes a theory better than another, generally speaking? So I think we've got,
Okay, so let's pick an example from science first, so physics. So let's compare Newton's theory of gravitation and Einstein's theory of gravitation. There's not much disagreement anywhere about the claim that Einstein has better theory than Newton. So what are the differences between the two theories? The story I'm about to tell is probably not the standard story, but it will do. I think that when you write out the two theories in the same mathematical notation, it turns out that Einstein's theory is simpler than Newton's. Einstein's theory lacks a posit that Newton's theory has, namely about absolute simultaneity. So you get this commitment to something in Newton's theory that's absent from Einstein's theory. But otherwise, when you write the theories out, they've got the same sort of commitments. So Einstein's theory is simpler, which is a positive. But more importantly, there's data that fits with Einstein's theory and simply doesn't fit with Newton's theory. So one way of thinking about it is that Newton's theory makes false predictions where Einstein's theory makes accurate predictions. Another way of thinking about it is just that there's the explanations that you get out of Einstein's theory are better than the explanations that you get out of Newton's theory, because Einstein's theory is able to explain the behavior of certain things that Newton's theory can't. When Newton's theory tries to explain it, it gets it wrong, right? It doesn't, because it doesn't fit the data. So that gives you simplicity, fit with data, and something about the kind of breadth and depth and goodness of explanation as important theoretical virtues in science. Maybe there's something about kind of unification of disparate phenomena too. I think that fits somewhere in between the two things, simplicity and explanation. So if you really wanted to simplify it, you might think of it this way, that when you're comparing theories, what you're looking for is the theory that does the best at trading off simplicity against goodness of explanation. It just turns out in the case that I gave you that one theory does better on both of those than the other. But I think of that way of thinking about theories as something that will just transfer across to philosophy. So at least when we're comparing worldviews, when we're doing the kind of theism versus naturalism thing, it's actually useful to think in those terms. Okay, so which one of these views is doing better at trading off simplicity of various kinds against breadth and depth of explanation?
Okay.
Maybe you don't
Yeah.
have prediction in quite the same way that you do in the sciences, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's what I was going to ask. You predicted it because in your book you also talk about predictive accuracy, and we can say some more about that later. I think we have a section planned to talk a little bit about maybe what data naturalism may predict that theism doesn't, or vice versa. Things like biological evolution and suffering, but we can come back to that. So I think that's a good place to start. So let's talk then a little bit about when we're talking about explaining data. Let's talk then a little bit about explanation in philosophy. There's a couple ways, I think. So for somebody like Swinburne, the preferred line is something broadly Bayesian. But it might be good to start off covering, are there different kinds of explanation or explanations that come in degrees? So we have explanations in science, but it seems like there's kind of a different criteria for what counts as a scientific explanation and, say, a metaphysical one. And so when we're talking about these global worldviews, it seems like we're talking a lot about metaphysics. So are there different senses of explanation we need to talk about? And how should we even think about explanation? I know this is broad, so we don't have to, go super in depth on everything about it, but just to give a general outline.
Right. So talk about explanation has lots of dimensions to it. So one topic is about causal explanation, understanding what it is when you say that one thing causes another. And then when you ask why did something happen, you cite the cause as the explanation of why it happened. That's quite a familiar idea, though one that suffered something of a blow when Hume offered his account of causation. But I think that recently causal explanation has been getting a kind of good run, like say in the last 20 years or so. And you might think of that as a kind of paradigm of explanation, but also if we're thinking about the universe and the stuff that's in it, we might think that causal explanation is going to really be the kind of primary kind of explanation that we're going to need to appeal to. There are different ideas about exactly how a causal explanation works, but still you might think that that's going to be a very important part of the overall story. There are other things that we talk about where we use the word explanation. So you might talk about mathematical explanation, for example, or you might talk about ethical explanation, or you might talk about metaphysical explanation. There are certainly people who are very skeptical about whether there could be any kinds of metaphysical explanations that go beyond the causal explanation that you invoke in the sciences. There are plenty of people who these days who are. I'm thinking in particular of Ladyman and Ross, but there are other people who think that the only explanations worth having are going to be explanations from the sciences, and we should just kind of cut everything else.
Okay. Yeah, I know the whole the Ladyman Ross project is really interesting, new kind of development in a completely naturalized metaphysics. So that's really cool. Is there anything else you wanted to say? I know we've talked a little bit before over email about kind of your preferred Bayesian account of certain things of explanation. Did you want to go over that at all, or did you kind of cover?
So it's not clear to me how to relate the kind of Bayesian framework to the talk about theoretical virtues. It's not clear whether in the end there's very much difference between them. So the way that Bayesians will go, if we're talking about, say, if we've got a couple of hypotheses and we want to know which one is to be preferred on evidence that we've got, we should use the kind of odds version of Bayes' theorem. And so the posterior probabilities of the ratio of the posterior probabilities of the hypotheses on the evidence should just be the product of the ratio of the prior probabilities and the likelihoods, where the likelihoods are the probability of the evidence on the hypotheses. Right. Now, one way of thinking about what you're doing there is when you're comparing the priors, roughly you're comparing the simplicity of the theories, and when you're comparing the likelihoods, roughly you're comparing how well they explain the data, right? And so that makes it sound as though the kind of theory choice is going to come out much the same whether you do it sort of without the numbers, but kind of impressionistically in terms of the virtues, or whether you try to do it with the numbers, where to some extent the numbers don't really matter, right? I mean, prior probabilities, the numbers tend to be made up, but people try to estimate them in a way that they feel does justice to the sort of comparative simplicity of the hypotheses. And that feels to me very much like what you do anyway if you're kind of comparing the simplicity of two theories, because there's quite a few things to think about. I mean, you have to think about how many different kinds of things the theory is committed to, what ideology you need, what primitive concepts you need in order to frame the theory, and what postulates you need if you were kind of axiomatizing the theory, what would be the primitive from which you could derive all the rest of the theory. And so there's at least three dimensions to the kind of simplicity there.
Right.
And when people say, so when Bayesians say sort of prior probabilities, it's kind of reasonable to make this one such and that one this amount that's, like a factor of 10 less or more or whatever. That's not a science. It's a kind of dark art, right?
Yeah, a lot of abstraction going on there. Okay. Yeah, I share a lot of those intuitions there. So because when you see some arguments for the resurrection, like a Bayesian argument for the resurrection of Jesus, and you get the priors, it's like sometimes you just look at it and you're like, where are you getting these priors and things like that. So, well, that comes in with a couple different Bayesian arguments, right. I guess that's just one example.
Well, it comes into almost all of them, because there is this question about where did those priors come from, and the answer is always, well, I just made them up, right?
Yeah, that seems right to me. That's kind of had similar intuitions, and friends and I have talked about this. So, yeah, that's all good. I think I want to bring more about this part up in our next section on necessity and explanation, but just to kind of give a preliminary here, I want to talk a little bit about grounding and metaphysical grounding and some recent work that's been done on that and what bearing that may have, if at all, to explanation. Because a lot of proponents of metaphysical grounding, like say a big one right now is Kit Fine, think that, and he has like a particular essentialist account of grounding. They tend to want to say that grounding is very, very closely tied in with explanation. So if we say, if P then Q, Q is then grounded. If Q is true, it's grounded in P and therefore explained. And I share the intuition with them that, if a fact is grounded, it's explained, at least in some sense. I share that intuition, if nothing else. But there may be cases in which that doesn't hold, or there's less about grounding relations. And I have more to say to this when we talk about necessity, but there are also different kinds of grounding. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. I mean, the main example that Kit Fine uses is, I think it's the clay statue example. So, say we have a clay statue of someone, Julius Caesar, what is it that grounds the fact that this is a statue of Julius Caesar? Is it just the clay? Well, surely it can't, just be that, because we can make differences to the clay here and there, and it's still a statue of Julius Caesar. So Fine wants to say there's some essentialist account. He's kind of has like a naturalized, almost hylomorphist account of there being some form or some essence united with the matter that grounds the fact that this is a clay statue of Julius Caesar. It's not merely the fact that we have clay particles arranged Julius Caesar-wise. There's more to the grounding relation. And so whether or not we accept that account of essences, which I don't think you do, that's still just an example of grounding. But I think that's just one of the examples of, say, like composition or constitution. So what are your thoughts broadly on grounding's relation to explanation here?
Okay, so there's a lot to cover. So I recognize I'm skeptical about grounding to a fairly large extent. I'm quite happy to classify a bunch of relations as grounding relations. And so you've already mentioned composition and constitution, and I would add supervenience and probably realization as well. But if we think about those relations on their own, they don't seem to me to be particularly explanatory relations. So, I mean, there's something else that's going on. Some people think that there's a kind of relation that sits below all of these, kind of grounding with a capital G, which really is an explanatory relation. And that I'm skeptical about. And I'm skeptical that you need more in your theory than just having composition, constitution, supervenience, realization, and a bunch of relations of those kinds for various purposes. The example about the statue and the clay, if the question is sort of what makes this a statue of Aristotle, that's quite a complicated thing to answer. Presumably, though, it has something to do with the making of the statue and what was the makers of the statue were trying to do, right? So it may have something to do with them having sufficient skill to make it a reasonable likeness to Aristotle, but it might not, right? I mean, it's kind of, I mean, there are all these, I mean, we're kind of moving into questions in the philosophy of art here, really. Yeah. There are all these kind of tricky questions about the role that intentions play in determining whether or not something is a representation of something else, is an artistic representation of something else, whether a particular painting actually is a painting of, I don't know, Lou Reed or whoever. I'm thinking maybe Andy Warhol would have done such a painting. So, but I don't see that there's kind of any need to talk about grounding in this case. There's something which counts as an explanation of this thing's being, you know, a statue of Aristotle, say. But that will just be pointing to certain kind of historical features, certain features of history at the time that it was made, I think. And if it turns out that it's not, that there's no kind of causal connection between Aristotle himself and the likeness of the statue, then it isn't the statue of Aristotle, right? It's just something that kind of accidentally and weirdly looks a lot like he used to look once upon a time. Right. So I don't see, when I was talking about constitution, I was actually thinking about something else. In the case of the statue and the clay, I was thinking that here's something that's true, that the statue's constituted from the clay. And I'm thinking of the clay as a kind of stuff. I'm not thinking of it as another thing here. I'm thinking there's some stuff that constitutes the statue. That's what the constitution relation is. It's a kind of stuff to thing or thing to stuff relation. There are kind of people who worry about whether the lump of clay is the same thing as the statue. I think that that's kind of misplaced, because that's a misplaced worry, because the actual relationship isn't between two things. But anyway, so we're kind of moving slightly off the main point.
Well, you know, yeah, exactly. Well, I don't know if we need a visual help here. It's not clay, but I do have my statue of Aristotle. So if we need a visual,
right, perfect.
Yeah, but it's not clay, so it doesn't help as much. All All right. So yeah, that's, again, we don't have to go super, and we were just going to note that, I mean, any of the literature on explanation and, philosophy of science even is super complicated. So we're not going to be able to go through all of that. But just to give a general account, I think it's good when we're talking about explanation, we should talk about what explanation is. So it's good to get some preliminary stuff out of the way, and people may disagree, with quibbles here and there. But I think to the overall case, it's not going to be super important. I did want to make a point. Well, I'll move this into our thing on necessity, a kind of epistemology and some modal skepticism worries. I guess I can do that now. So, I mean, Felipe Leon's kind of recently developed a view called mitigated modal skepticism, in which we really only have knowledge of the humdrum, kind of what's around us. So we mostly have intimate knowledge of how the actual world is. And so when we're talking about things like necessity and contingency broadly with other possible worlds, he wants to say that we really only have a limited idea of what possibility is in this modal sense, because it's got to be, at least pretty close counterfactually to the actual world. So we only have really reliable modal knowledge about the actual world, and maybe a couple possible worlds that are pretty close in terms of being tied to similar accounts of possibility. So I'm trying to remember the example he gives. Like, it's possible for me to walk into my kitchen and, like, cut up a watermelon and eat it. And I know it's possible for me to do that based on prior things I know about this actual world. So even if I don't do that, I can have knowledge that there's a possible world in which I did. So we can have this knowledge of possible worlds, but it's very much grounded in the actual. And this seems to fit pretty well with your broad modal account, which is, Aristotelian, and every possible world shares some history, causal history with the actual world. But I mean, he's used that kind of idea to cast doubt on what we can know in terms of giving explanations as far as necessary things, necessary facts or beings, because we really only have a very limited knowledge of possible worlds. So I don't want to spend too much time on this because we have so much to get through, but I just wanted to bring that up briefly and see what you thought about it, if anything.
Yeah, so it's tricky
Mm-hmm.
because, as you mentioned, there's very different ideas about modal metaphysics. You have the one idea, which is kind of the Aristotelian one, that we suppose that possibilities have to pay their way. In order to believe in a possibility, you've got to have a reason to commit yourself to it, and perhaps the only times that you really need to commit yourself to possibilities is where you've got causal indeterminism, because if it's indeterministic, it could go one way, it could go another way. Depending how you frame the rest of your theory, they might be all the possibilities that there are. Though if you kind of push back far enough, think about some very early branching off, worlds could still be quite different from ours in ways that it's impossible for us to calculate. So this is where the kind of skepticism comes in, that we're not going to have that much knowledge about the kind of limits of possibility. But the possibilities that are really of interest to us are when you get to a particular point where there's some indeterministic causation going on, that we know what the range of possibilities for that is. And then, that launches a whole lot of new worlds, and the possibilities for them quickly become too hard to calculate. That's very different from the kind of conceivability view about possibility, where basically if you can conceive it and you can't see anything wrong with your conceiving, then you just assume it's possible. And that gives you a much, much, much broader range of possibilities. And then there's this question, right, about, so should you be a minimalist or a maximalist about possibilities, right? Should you just have the minimum number that you need, or should you go for this kind of,
go big or go home?
Yeah. And I don't know. So John Heil is one person who's written some stuff about this, and he's quite puzzled by why you would go beyond the minimum that you need, right? Why think that our knowledge of possibility in particular goes beyond the kind of, so this is now agreeing with Leon's position, right? Felipe Leon's position, that we shouldn't think that our knowledge goes beyond, but why think that anything goes beyond? Why think that there are more possibilities? And I'm I'm quite sympathetic to that kind of view. But I'm also, there's this other question about necessities and whether you should seek to minimize them as well,
Mm.
because then you end up with this kind of tension. Like if you think about the laws of nature, should you think they're necessary or not? Supposing there are laws of nature, or supposing that there are boundary conditions, should you suppose that they're necessary or not? Because if they're not, if they're not necessary, if they're contingent, then at least from certain perspectives, it looks like they can't have any explanation. So then it looks like they're going to be primitives in your theory. And if you're going to have primitives there, why not just opt for necessities, right? And then think about the kind of overall picture. Now, you might think that that style of theorizing is just too unconstrained, but what's useful about it is that you can, or one way of thinking about what's useful about it is that you can recognize your options and be undecided between them. So you might think, well, if there's an initial state, either it's contingent and there's no explaining it, or it's necessary and there's no explaining why it's necessary. It could go, I mean, it could, as in, you know, it seems like you could believe that it goes one way or that it goes the other. And there's nothing wrong with just being undecided between those two options. Right? And
Right.
that's, so when I first started writing about this stuff, which is a while ago, back in about 2012, I wrote a chapter for a book that Neil Manson edited. And I was thinking about cosmological arguments and thinking about the options just in these very general terms. And my idea was that no matter which way you go, which option you pick, naturalism will look better than theism. Right. So you don't, if you're a naturalist, you don't have to pretend that you know whether we should think the laws are necessary or contingent, the initial conditions are necessary or contingent, or whatever. It's just that no matter which way it plays out, naturalism is going to look better. And sometimes in my more recent writings, I've opted for the kind of hard line, look, we should think the laws are necessary, we should think the initial conditions are necessary. That's more for making exposition easier and for kind of simplifying the argument than for any real conviction that we kind of have to, or that we should jump that way.
Okay.
But it's useful to have a single definite position to discuss rather than having a sort of, oh, there's this bit, but it could go all these different ways, and there's this bit, but it could go all those different ways, and so on. And so my most recent project has been to try to articulate a version of the theory where you have necessary origin, necessary laws, and so on. But if you really push me hard, I'm not that committed to it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, that's good to know.
But
All right,
there's
thanks.
kind of expository reasons why it's useful to try to kind of nut out one of these views in as much detail as I'm capable of doing.
Right. And it's sometimes easier when you're talking about, like, certain contingency arguments, just to grant as much as you can and be like, fine, we have necessity, let's see where that gets us. It
Yeah.
doesn't get us to God. So that's maybe more of a pragmatic reason why it's more useful. You'll have to do less explanatory work, which we'll talk a little bit more about that when we're
But it's
talking
also,
about
there's a kind of flip side to that, which is if the person that you're arguing with says, well, maybe I'll give up the necessity, it's useful to have thought about that
the
case
contingency
too.
as well.
It's useful to think about the full range of cases as far as we can conceive of them.
Right. Yeah, theists aren't usually too big of fans of giving up the necessity stuff, but if you get like a Swinburnian account,
Swinburne's not a big fan of necessity. He's old enough to remember when people were kind of skeptical about the whole notion of necessity.
Oh, right. Yeah, I think even back with like Mackey and Miracle of Theism as well, which I have up there somewhere. So
yeah, so at the same time, they were both. I mean, they were, Mackey and Swinburne were quite similar in many ways. They were both happy to go for a kind of Bayesian way of formulating their discussion, and they were both skeptical about some of the metaphysics that became more pronounced later on. Yeah.
Right. Okay, good. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that. I think, sorry to switch up the order from the outline on you, but I think we could talk right now a little bit about like just characterizing naturalism and theism just really quickly. and then we can talk about a little bit more of the necessity and explanation stuff, because I have some more questions on that when we talk about, explaining data on cosmology and things like that. So for starters, I guess the question is, which will characterize this when we get into particular arguments, like what data is it that we're trying to explain with our worldviews, and what's the best way to kind of formulate a thesis for these worldviews we're comparing. So naturalism in broader philosophy kind of has a different meaning than we're using it in terms of naturalizing, which is a tradition that arguably goes back to Hume, maybe before. So is it fair to characterize metaphysical naturalism as a kind of physicalism, where just kind of the objects or scientific theories are all that exist? Maybe not necessarily a reductive account. So is naturalism, in this metaphysical sense that you're meaning it, kind of, should we just think about that as physicalism, as kind of a version of the physicalist thesis to make it clearer?
Right, except that it's naturalism rather than physicalism, because there's this view that maybe the sciences, there's no kind of reductive relations between the sciences. So, I mean, yes, up to a point, though. I'm certainly including the social sciences amongst the sciences, so naturalism might be misleading in that respect. And I would also include things like history, which is maybe no kind of science, but would also be part of what is perfectly legitimate, right? So, and also this is not meant to exclude common sense, because there's a lot that we know about the world that we don't know by science or by application of scientific method, like what types of cereal I've got in the cupboard, which I do know, right? So there's right. Naturalism is not scientism or some sort of narrowly, there's a bunch of academic disciplines and the only things that we can know are the things that those academic disciplines say are true. That's not how I want to characterize naturalism. But at least as a kind of first pass, what's important about naturalism is the idea that causes, all the causes that there are natural causes. I mean, that would be one way of putting it. So that and the natural causes are all things that are going to be recognized by science. Whether they're studied by science is a different matter, but they're all recognized in the sciences. So physicists recognize regular causes in the setting up of their experiments, in talking to one another. If they get their pen and they try to write on paper, ink comes out on the paper. They don't have to explain that in any type of scientific terms. But it's part of what's in the background to the science that they do. Right.
Okay.
So,
yeah. So I was thinking more in terms of, because there is the physicalist view on which all of our truths about even other scientific fields reduce eventually to truths about physics. Ultimately, I guess I wonder if you would take the view kind of more broadly, just answering, say, one of Quine's fundamental questions of just like, what is there? When we're answering that question, is it fair to say that what there is on this view is just physical stuff? And of course, there are explanations that may not invoke that, or there may be ways of talking that aren't talking about merely physical entities. But at the end of the day, is our ontology going to be composed of physical objects we may talk about differently?
So that's also quite tricky. I wanted to stick to what I say about the natural universe. And of course, that's just made up of natural objects. I wanted to leave it open for naturalists, whether they think they're abstract objects or not, as Quine did. Quine thought there were sets, and he didn't think of them as being parts of the natural world. So if the ontology was restricted to the kind of ontology of physical objects, then Quine wouldn't count as a naturalist, whereas I think he should count. On the other hand, I'm quite fond of the idea of trying to get rid of abstract objects altogether, doing without them, which is not easy. And I don't know whether it can be done or not. But that just goes along with the kind of trading off, right? Minimizing your commitments, maximizing what you can explain. If you can do without abstract objects and the costs are not too high, then that's what you should do. Whether you can do without them, that's a whole different question.
Right. Okay.
But it shouldn't be written in to naturalism that you've got to do without them, right? Because your thesis can be just about causal reality, and that's what I think it should be about. There's a couple of other optional bits. So I go backwards and forwards. Sometimes I define naturalism in the way that we just did, more or less. Other times I add in some more stuff. And the more stuff is, first of all, about minds, that the only sort of minded things there are organisms that appear in the universe quite late in its history, at least relative to us. Like, you've got to have third generation stars before you can have organisms, basically. And so, as I say it, minds are late and local. So it's not like the universe has a mind. It's not like anything other than organisms has a mind. It's not like there are things outside the universe that have minds. All of that is ruled out on the way that I'm thinking about naturalism. But you might prefer not to call that part of naturalism, and many naturalists would not. Many naturalists don't agree with what I just said. And the third thing is something else that, again, maybe it's more that it's kind of fundamental to my worldview than you should pair it with naturalism, is the idea that there's nothing that's worthy of worship.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another part. Now, the last bits of it are kind of useful if we're setting up the sort of fundamentals of a worldview to pit against theism, right? They're less useful if you're trying to setting up naturalism as a kind of broad-scale philosophical system, and you're interested in talking about where things like morality and values and normativity fit into the picture, because you're not going to be able to, it's not plausible that you're going to be able to reduce morality, normativity more generally to science. And so there's going to be this question about where it fits and how you explain it, what you say about it.
Okay. Yes, there are some questions that are non-reductive in that sense. Okay, that's good. And you answered along the way there kind of one question I already had, which is, when Philippe Leon argues like what he calls liberal naturalism, he characterizes that view as he includes like cosmopsychism, like the idea that the universe itself is like fundamentally has like these proto-mental properties. That wouldn't be fit on your view, but there are these different ideas of that. So we don't have to go into any of that anymore, but that's
so I can say, right, that's part of the reason for adopting a much broader account like the one I began with just the kind of causal stuff is natural, and leaving everything else out, because then you haven't taken a stance on whether quarks and electrons have kind of proto-psychological properties or not. I mean, obviously, I've told you with the other things I've said where I stand on those questions,
right.
but that's separate from the if you want to make naturalism a broad church, then you'll let all those views in. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's good to start off with. So yeah, I think that covers most of our important preliminary stuff. I mean, when we're talking about theism, I guess we're talking about what you've called in your writing orthodoxly conceived monotheistic gods. I think everybody's I mean, there are differences in terms of, same with naturalists. When you ask theists, they have all these different ideas about what that would look like. You have panentheists, classical theists, neoclassical theists. So we don't have to go into the depths of all that. I just wanted to bring up the point. When we're talking about explanation, a lot of theists, at least at a more lay level, tend to think that there's a direct kind of causal or explanatory relation between God and certain phenomena, that it's not clear that there actually is. So what I mean by that is what would it look like to say that God explains something? So a lot of times people say that naturalists, which we'll get into this when we talk a little bit later about explaining consciousness, but they'll say things like, naturalists don't have the resources to explain minds. Like, on naturalism, minds could have arisen. But if God exists, then we could get minds. And it's not always filled out what that story looks like. And I think you've stressed this a lot in your work in terms of kind of pressing theism for these explanatory, because there's not really any sort of entailment relation or explanatory relation between the proposition God exists and the proposition there are minds. There's stuff you have to fill in there. And once you do, it doesn't always, it turns out that the theistic explanations really don't have advantages, or at least you've argued. So do you want to expound a little bit on like what it would even mean for God to explain a certain set of phenomena? So when we're talking about him explaining anything.
So take a different example. Take the supposed fine-tuning of the physical constants.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So there's a bunch of these parameters in physical theory that we've got that, according to our modeling, if you vary the values of the parameters a little bit, you don't get life. In fact, you don't get, you either get a sort of empty universe or you get a universe that lasts for a tiny fraction of a second. Right. So it looks as though, some people think that that must mean that the parameters were selected in order that, well, people say in order that we get life, but that's not obvious because we wouldn't have had stars and we wouldn't have had the coronavirus. Who knows what it was selected for, right? That's completely up in the air. But on the assumption that there's going to be some of these parameters in final theory, which is not obviously correct, but might be true. There's a question about how to explain them taking the values that they do. Now, there's a range of things that you could say, but one thing that you could say is that God picked them, right? God wanted those values to be just as they are, and that's why they are as they are. Okay, now, for each of the values, that must mean that there's a desire that God has, that that value be just as it is. And when we ask, why does God have that desire, it's not clear what answer we're going to get, right? But partly because we will ask this question, could God have made other universes? All right, God's supposed to be omnipotent, so it seems like the answer should be yes. But if the answer is yes, then there's other possible worlds where God makes these universes that collapse after a tiny fraction of a second or blow apart really quickly. And then there's this question, okay, so our world is this way, but it could have been all those other ways. Why is it this way rather than the other ways that it could have been? Is there any advantage, any explanatory progress that we've made in narrowing down why the values are as they are in terms of God's desires for them, if in turn God's desires turn out to have this exact same property that there's this huge range of ways they could have gone, and it looks like this one was selected, right? And so the worry is that although it looked like there was some explanatory progress being made here, it's not so clear that there is, really. Right? It doesn't look as though the theist is doing any better than the naturalist was. If the naturalist just said, I've got no explanation, it looks like although the theist has an explanation for this particular point, there's a corresponding point in the theist theory where there's no explanation. Right? And so, so there's no explanatory progress. That's kind of a worry that you might have. And you might think that it generalizes because sort of saying God wanted it always raises this question, could God have wanted something else? And if so, why did we get God having this particular want rather than the other wants that God could have had?
Right. Okay. Yeah. All right. So I got it. This is good. We're getting into this. This was going to be in one of my sections anyways. So you talked about this a good bit with Alex, and you guys, and your video with him, and you guys answered a good number of questions I had, but there were a couple more I wanted to go through, particularly in answering some stuff that comes up in Alex Pruse's book on, PSR and how he squares it with libertarian free will in this one chapter. And you guys covered a good bit of this, but I guess one way to phrase it is, or one question to ask for clarification, a lot of theists, obviously, or most of them, I think it's fair to say, want to affirm that God has libertarian free will. There's no, external forces. So it's just, there's no prior deterministic factors that determine why God has desire A rather than B. So on your account here, what you're talking about is just any view of libertarian free will going to have this problem of just having these kind of brute events? Or And because I guess the question for Claire, oh, sorry, you can go ahead, yeah.
So I think the answer to that is yes, but you have to be careful what's brute here. There'll be lots of people who'll say that there are no such things, no contrastive facts such as the fact that A rather than B, because A rather than B is just A and not B, right? And if A and B are exclusive, right? Once you've explained A, you've explained everything that there is to explain. But the contrastive fact is that from this indeterministic device, we got A rather than B. Now, what explains the indeterministic devices giving rise to A rather than B? There can't be an answer because it was indeterministic, right? So there's something here that has no explanation. And so there's something that's brute, namely it was brute that this indeterministic device gave rise to A rather than B. So apply that to God's libertarian actions, and there's a whole lot of bruteness now, because every time God makes a choice, there's God chose this thing rather than that thing. Why? Answer, no reason, right? There's nothing further to, there's no further explanation to give because there's nothing to appeal to. It's not no reason. Right, sorry, that wasn't the right thing to say. But there's no explanation of why we got A rather than B. If God chooses A, and partial explanation will be because one of the things that God was choosing between was A. Right? God had reasons for preferring A, for wanting A. But God also had reasons for wanting B, C, D, E, F, and if we're right about how many universes there could have been, there'll be an infinite list. Right.
Right.
So that's how I see it. There's something here that doesn't every time you appeal to indeterminism, that's a theoretical cost. Determinism is great because every alternative possibility is ruled out. So every time you say here's some indeterminism, that's costing you. The cost might be worth paying. For example, in quantum mechanics, it looks like we have really good reason for thinking that there are certain kinds of events that are indeterministic, right? So then we just bear the cost. But we would never choose indeterminism over determinism if we were trying to make the best theory that we could make. That's the kind of underlying thought.
Right. Okay. Well, this is good because this brings up something I've thought about. One worry that we may have as far as when we're comparing naturalism, theism, and explaining something like contingency. One may want to look at the idea that theists have a more fulfilling explanation because they don't have to appeal to indeterminism, which is what you've covered there a little bit. Because Proust defends what he calls like the reasoned choice model. So, God may have, these reasonable choices for choosing. He kind of compares it to say we have this humus fork view. Either it's just completely undetermined and unreasoned and free, but that doesn't seem super explanatorily satisfying. Or we can say it is reasoned and free. So the one thing he also says, and again, it's sometimes hard to get clear what he's actually defending in this chapter, as I mentioned to you, but he does at one point say a couple things about when we're talking about contrastive explanations and sufficient reason. What the defender of the PSR in this case and defender of God can say is just that we have a sufficient reason for every contingent proposition, and so that's not incompatible with these facts about contrastive explanations, because we've still explained the proposition that X chose A rather than B. Even though we've not necessarily explained the contrast itself, we still explained the proposition as to why God chose what he did. So we can give an account of explaining God's libertarian free action in a way. And so someone like Proust may want to say that we can give this account, whereas on naturalism, all of your chances and contingencies that are playing out differently, you just have to go for a complete random account. And maybe you can cite prior causal factors that are going on when you have these indeterminisms that play out. But so say the defender of the PSR and God's choices here wants to say something like that. They're like, well, we still have an explanation of this proposition. We don't have to say that it's unexplained or brute, and we don't have to say that it's completely random either, because if you have this randomness in your worldview, maybe it harms your predictive success. But that's a separate thing. So I mean, they may say, what do you say to the? And you've covered some of it, but that theism gives us a better explanation of why A rather than B, because it gives us an explanation of the proposition that, you know, God chose A. He had reasons, whether it be his love to actualize. And I know you and Alex talked about the Leibnizian view that say, you know, God just creates the best of all possible worlds. And you pointed out how this is just gets us to modal collapse, because if God, it's necessary that God. So what if Proust also says that God doesn't have to make the best possible world, but he can have reasoned choices for creating certain worlds as opposed to others. So what do you think about the idea then that theism gives us a more satisfactory explanation, because we can at least appeal to an explanation of this proposition, whereas on the naturalist view, we just have to go with complete indeterminism?
So I'm not sure that that's right, though. Um,
Me
so
neither.
what you can explain on both views is the range of things that can happen, right? Because you can explain that in terms of stuff that leads up to this point. I mean, or either that, or actually you can't, because it's all brute,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's one of the worries about the theistic position, because now we just push back to the reasons and we ask, so why does God have these reasons? And as opposed to other reasons that he might have had, if it's really true that he could make these other possible worlds, right? Which is, so I'm not seeing what the difference is, right? We can explain the setup, the features of the setup. It may be that that explanation itself involves at some points appeal to chances, but there's a kind of history that's tracing back to some initial point, right? And then we've got some evolution from that point, and we can explain, insofar as we can, the features of this new choice point where something indeterministic is going to happen. And then we get a consequence, right? And we can explain the consequence in the following way. We had this set up, and this was one of the things that could happen. That's all we can say about why we get it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so then we can say there's this causal trajectory that goes through this thing to A. In the case of the choices, you can think of it, okay, so there's this potentiality for God to act on the first choice, and a potentiality to act on the second, a potentiality to act on the third, potentiality to act on the fourth, and so on. But only one of them gets realized and none of the others do. And now what, in this world, God chooses A. Nearby possible world, God chooses B. Another nearby possible world, God chooses C. What's the difference between the worlds that explains why in this world we get A, in that world we get B, in that other world we get C? That's the contrastive question. It's not a question in this world about why we get A and not B. It's a comparison with the nearby worlds. I can't see any advantage that the theistic explanation in terms of choices is going to have over the kind of naturalistic, this is just some indeterministic thing. In this world we get A, in that world we get B, in this world we get C. In neither case is there anything to appeal to that explains why this world is actual. Why isn't the actual world the one with B, or the one with C, or the one with D?
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
it just seems to me that when if you ask the right question, then you end up with, this is just about indeterminism. It's nothing to do with what kind of indeterminism it is, whether it's quantum indeterminism or libertarian freedom or
Mm-hmm.
whatever.
Okay.
That's how it
Yeah.
seems to me.
Right. I was, reading through this chapter from Proust. I kept thinking, kind of like, this seems like it's kind of passing the buck to me, but I might just be missing something. So I keep looking. Because I think there's also something to be said when we're talking about possible worlds, and like contingent possible worlds. And we talk about causal histories, God's free choice or his desires are going to be part of possible worlds in a sense, because they're part of the causal history of why that world exists as opposed to another. And so this is the point that Robin Lepoidovin and others have raised about how necessary facts alone don't explain contingent ones, because they're telling you something about something all worlds share, and that's not going to give you an explanation as to why we have A rather than B in this possible world. And so, of course, the way to push back on that for the theist is to say that there's an important distinction between necessary beings and necessary facts. But of course, if the necessary being is the only work the necessary being's doing is grounding a contingent fact, it's not clear that we need that to be a choice. So there was one thing from Proust that I thought you'd probably disagree with, but I think when we look at including God's choices, and you've talked about this, and including God's choices as part of possible worlds, that gets us a little bit clearer on the problem here. And because this reasoned free choice account, the reasoned free choice is contingent. It's part of this possible world as opposed to another, unless you want to say it's necessary, right?
Right. So I think that's right. There was a time when people used to regularly conflate possible worlds and possible universes and talk about God's creating possible worlds. But that's just a mistake, right? If we're talking about possible worlds, God's part of each possible world in which God exists, which on the theistic view will be in all of them. Right.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I can predict that you disagree with Proust's suggestion that, we can say either we say that X freely chose A for R is self-explanatory, or we say that it's explained by just this reasoned free choice. So it's obviously not going to be. So you obviously will not agree with the idea that it's self-explanatory, right? There's like this kind of self-explanatory. Because this is one notion he brings up too early in the chapter of like, well, maybe we could have self-explanatory contingent facts, that we don't have to appeal to anything else. It's the case that these are self-explanatory. So if we do that, we can have an explanation of God's contingent choice.
That just seems to me a different way of saying I'm going to take this one as brute. It's got no explanation. Right? It's particularly because when you try it out, why A? Because A. Hang on. I was asking you for an explanation. You didn't give me one. Not yet. You're just pulling my leg, right? I asked you why A, right? It's self-explanation just looks absurd, right, on its face. So, of course, you want to take it as a brute explanatory cost. That's fine. Every single one of God's free choices for reasons. God wants this for this reason and that for this reason. And every single one of them is a brute theoretical cost. I've got no problems with that. That makes the view very easy to compete with.
Right. Yeah, I think
because
so.
I can just, for every one of those things that Proust is thinking he's explaining by appealing to one of those brute facts, I can just say, let's have the brute fact be the natural fact.
Right?
We do without God. And the cost, when you add it up, it's 1 for 1. So it's not going to be worse for the naturalist. The naturalist is going to win on the final accounting. So,
yeah.
So I don't think that that's, although I've got no objection to it being played out that way, I don't think that's the best move for the theist to make.
Right. Obviously, there's nothing that says they can't, and you talked about this, Alex, too. If they've already proven that God exists in some independent sense, then it's kind of spoils to the victor, right? Yeah, I think that's the way you put it. It's just like, all right, fine, but when we're talking purely about this in terms of grounding possible worlds, if we're grounding it in a decision God made, we've got two options. It's either necessary, in which we get modal collapse, or it's contingent, in which case, we've got indeterminism either way. I'll have to think a little bit more about the libertarian free will stuff and whether or not it's the same as indeterminism. But I did want to get your thoughts on that a little more.
Okay, so if you go for the principle of alternative possibilities, which used to be the way that libertarian freedom was explained, then you will get indeterminism. But there's a lot of literature in the last 20 years that claims to be libertarian and doesn't go for the principle of alternative possibilities, so it's less clear, right? The idea is that somehow or other you can be a libertarian and yet deny that in the circumstances in which you're acting, you could have done something other than the thing that you actually did. when I read that literature, it always sounds to me like they're now just poaching where the compatibilists happily lie, and they're actually just being compatibilists as well. But I can't say that I'm an absolute expert on all of the literature. So
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of complexity to go through just in that, as with all these things. We have more to discuss. Sorry, I gotta sort out my video here just a second. Yeah, I in terms of, well, there's another proposition or a proposed explanation that Proust wants to give in some sense, and that is just that we can change the principle of sufficient reason to, say, principle of good reason. So we can have a good explanation, maybe not a complete one, and so the theist can just say that they have a good explanation, although it's not maybe completely satisfactory. So do you think that's saying anything different that's already been said, or is that just kind of covering the same stuff?
So then I think I don't disagree with him about that, but that same principle of good reason is available to the naturalist, at least to my kind of naturalist, because I think that there's this causal network with boundary condition and laws, and I think that everything apart from the laws and the boundary conditions is explained ultimately in terms of the laws and the boundary conditions. Of course, there's a sequence. There are some things that are causally downstream from others, but it turns out that there's nothing in the network of causal reality that has no explanation, or that lacks a good explanation in the sense that he just described. So we don't have to disagree about principle of good reason.
Right. Okay. So to get even a little bit more clear here on your view, so you would agree then with the idea that all explanation at the end of the day is going to be contrastive, at least in some sense?
Not necessarily. It might be that some causation is deterministic and the rest of it's indeterministic. It might be that the web of causal reality involves a mix. I don't think that it's going to be very plausible to say that everything's indeterministic. I also don't think it's very plausible to say that everything's deterministic. So I guess I'm kind of committed to the kind of in-between view where you have a mix of the two.
Gotcha. Okay. So we'll come back a little bit to talking about, I think, contingency when we talk about some of your proposed solutions on cosmological arguments broadly in your book, in terms of comparing global causal reality to, say, what we'd call local. But real quick, it might be good to go through, to switch gears a little, in terms of some other cosmological facts that theists want to claim God can explain. So I'm thinking here primarily of infinity, so like just the beginnings or the origins of the universe as we know it, and whether or not we can have this kind of beginningless past view, but also kind of a view of causal finitism. And I apologize for my video going out there for a minute. I had some problems with my setup here, but it should be all good now as long as I sort out my. So if I seem scattered, I was trying to work some of that out. So I guess the way to put this, we're going to talk about like the Kalam, and there's some similar things you've said about the Kalam to contingency in your book, in terms about when we're comparing what we mean by causal reality and some of these premises. So do theists have a better explanation of like the finite universe, if we're going to say that it's not actually infinite? Do they have a better explanation of there being some beginning point of the universe? We can start with that. That's a simpler one, just the standard the Kalam. But there's also the causal finitist issues with paradoxes, which we'll hopefully talk some more about with Alex. But just for starters, what do you think about? And you can kind of build in here what you've thought about comparing causal reality in these cases.
So It seems to me that positing God as a cause of the existence of the universe is just not going to turn out to be a winning strategy, no matter how we think about it. So if we suppose that there's a beginning, so there's a first state of the universe, well, just of the universe,
Mm-hmm.
what properties are we going to ascribe to the initial state? Are we going to think that it exists of necessity or that it exists contingently? Are we going to think that it's got properties of necessity, right? Or does it have some properties only contingently? If you postulated God beforehand, you're going to have the same questions about God, necessary or contingent
Mm-hmm.
with respect to existence and with respect to properties. No matter how you go on those questions, you've got an extra entity, and the explanatory resources are going to be the same either way. So it doesn't seem to me that there's going to be any advantage, if what you're interested in is explaining the existence of the universe, to postulate God beforehand. It's true that on the God view, there's an explanation for something that isn't explained on the naturalist view, namely the existence of the universe. But you're comparing the wrong things, because you have to think about the theist view of causal reality as a whole. If you think that it's got, you may think that it regresses infinitely, you may not. We'll leave that aside. If you think it's got a starting point, that starting point is either necessary or contingent with respect to existence and its properties. The naturalist has exactly the same range of options about global reality that the theist has. It's just that the naturalist thinks that global reality and natural reality coincide. So this is the reason why postulating God won't be an advantage. So in a nutshell, I think that's what you wanted. That was the aspect of my view that you want me to discuss.
Right. Yeah, because that was really kind of a central part of your explanation of various cosmological arguments in your book, which I found really interesting and helpful, because it's such a simple distinction to make, but it helps so much when thinking about these things. That, like, well, hang on, we're kind of equivocating here almost when we talk about this, because naturalists are just going to I remember the way you put in your book was like, well, what then will this say about global causal reality? Naturalists just assume that natural causal reality is just global causal reality. So how is this supposed to, show me that that's contingent, or has a beginning, that's caused by God in the Kalam case? So what you said to the Kalam case there, when we're talking about actual infinites, that would also apply, it seems, to like causal finitism, because we've chatted about this a little bit, I think. I guess the first question is whether or not we should believe in causal finitism. We can set that to the side, assuming this new direction that Kalam arguments want to take is not one about actual infinites existing. It's about infinites being causally efficacious. So the Grim Reaper paradox is the favored one for this that Rob Koons and Alex Proust use, but there are others like the infinite mob, I think maybe even like Tristram Shandy, and you've covered some of these cases in your book. But so assuming that, but with leaving whether or not we should be causal finitists to the side, we can expound on that maybe if we do another video with Alex. But say we accept that the causal finitist arguments, it sounds then that should really have no bearing on the theism versus naturalism, because naturalists can have these perfectly consistent models on which we have a causally finite reality, right? So this shouldn't really give us reason to prefer theism to naturalism.
So I think that's right. And those models are meant to be ruling out the infinite regress case. That's all they're meant to do. And there have been, historically, for a long time, there have been lots of naturalists who've wanted to say, well, that's a possible case. And if it's in, then we've got a kind of possible answer to the people running the Kalam argument. What you just said is exactly right. I don't think that you need to say that. It doesn't matter whether it's in or out. It doesn't matter what the outcome is. You just think about the models and compare them directly. You think about all the models. And if you're thinking about some models that are not really possible, that doesn't matter, right? Because it's only a comparison in every case. All you want to argue is that no matter which model we pick, the naturalist is doing better than the theist, at least if all we're interested in is explaining the existence of the universe. And so the kind of elements of the model of the universe in one case and the universe plus God in the other case.
Right. Okay. Because it sounds like, your preferred model of naturalism is causally finite anyways. So it's like, hey, I already agree with you there. Or, your
So
preferred, the toes to the fire, that's the initial
yeah,
singularity view.
sure. So, but I'm not 100% sure that's right. I mean, I mean, the way I said it was, look, if you force me to choose, yeah, put my toes
Right.
to the feet to the fire, I'm going to go for the finite. But there are cosmologists, so Anthony Aguirre is one, who has a really interesting cosmological model. It's a multiverse model, which is infinite in the past, right? So, and it seems to fit quite well with the data that we've got. Nothing in the arguments that philosophers give allegedly against the possibility of an infinite past are going to bear on his model, because there's no reason to suppose, for example, that just because there's this kind of infinite past in the space in which all the possible universes exist. Sorry, not all the universes exist, the many universes exist, that anywhere in that reality there's going to be a universe that itself has an infinite past, and in which there could be an infinite sequence of Grim Reapers or whatever, right? Whether those things are possible is kind of irrelevant to whether the cosmological model is correct or not. And there are all these worries about Hilbert's Hotel that have to do with manipulating things and moving them around. But there's nothing that can move around the universes in that kind of background space that they exist in any that can manipulate them in any way that could produce any kind of contradiction. And we're not supposing that, again, sort of it's certainly contrary to the physics of our world, and I'm assuming contrary to the physics of every world, that you can have locations to an infinite degree of precision getting smaller and smaller and smaller, right? I mean, we're pretty sure that that's not true about our world, that there's a Planck length, and, at a certain point, the localizability that you need for the Grim Reapers is just impossible. I'm thinking even on this view where you've got an infinite past in the space of universes. I don't know if that's sufficiently clear. But.
Right. Yeah. No, I think so. It makes sense. And I think there's something to be said also, what you mentioned there with cosmology and kind of these models that some physicists have, and I think it's a point you brought up in the book about fine tuning as well. Some of these questions we just don't have the sufficient science to make claims about. So when we're talking about certain cosmological fine tuning, our physics may just not be far along enough for us to actually even say that this is fine tuned in any relevant sense. I mean, you already gave the one objection that, like, even if it is, it's still the explanatory resource is going to be either contingent or necessary still with God, so it doesn't help. But even without that, I think you made the point, and I think this applies to a lot of things, because there's the fine tuning of the constants. There's also the infinite models, infinite past, but then also when people talk about, like, one preferred also account is fine tuning in biology, like God had to tinker with certain things either in the Cambrian era, or there's people that want to deny any kind of like reductionism and say a biogenesis is just impossible, like we couldn't have gotten organic matter from inorganic. And so God just had to, atheistic evolutionists want to say, well, God just had to kind of, snap his fingers and set the spark of organic life on its way, and then evolution could happen. But without God, we couldn't have that. So it seems like with a lot of these things, we're kind of making, the argument being made is making some assumptions about science that we just don't have yet. I mean, we seem to have models on which things like abiogenesis seem fine. So I don't know if you wanted to say any more about that in terms of science informing some of these arguments that we just can't say much about yet.
So I guess that cuts a little bit both ways, because, I mean, what you were just saying is the science isn't fully in yet. And so that leaves this kind of zone of potential uncertainty. But there's nothing here that says fill it with God, right? Because there's more science to come, right? And you know, you wouldn't think, if on any of the things that you've mentioned, that just kind of looking at them, that it's kind of obvious that science is never going to fill in, right, in a way that resolves the problems.
Right. And in fact, with some of the cases, it seems like we actually have reason to think the opposite. We have reason to think science will figure it out. Like with experiments in abiogenesis, we have, kind of recreations where proteins form like the basic building blocks. So in some of these cases, it actually seems to go the other way. We seem to have good reason to think that science will figure it out. And so we shouldn't yet say that it can't. So I think that's an interesting point to make up. But the explanatory resources problem is perhaps the best route to go. I wanted to, well, since we're on the topic a little bit, I wanted to go back to actually what I had as our second topic. I skipped around on you, so I apologize for throwing you off the outline I gave you. I threw you off the outline I gave you, but talking a little bit more about necessity and explanation, we've covered a good bit of. So we've already talked about the most of the things I wanted to say about, the PSR, and there may be more to say about that later, but and like the difference between facts and beings and libertarian free will and all that, and self-explanation, bruteness. But the other thing is, when we're talking about explanation, whether it's a theistic model or a naturalistic one, I think you've mentioned before that you prefer a view on which explanation kind of ends and bottoms out at necessity. And while I'm not sure that I disagree with that, I just have some questions for clarification about it, and I included, I think, a couple in the outline. So there's a couple ways it can go. So I'll give two and see what you think. And one, I think you already kind of gave me a little bit of a response to in the document. But so when we think about Kripke with naming and necessity and giving us this account of having a posterior identification of necessities. So, there's kind of this causal account for names, but also there's the identification with, say, H2O with water, or I can know when I know that Clark Kent is Superman. There's an identity relation there. I can know all the facts about Clark Kent, and so I know all the facts about Superman, even if I don't know that I know that he's Superman and all that. So I guess the first thing I have, and then I'll go into the other one, is in some cases of there being necessary facts, at least. So let's talk about facts instead of beings and the Kripkean sense. It seems like we can give a causal history account of say, like, and also when he talks about rigid designators, we do have kind of an explanation of a kind of why these things are necessary, and they are necessary, but we figured that out a posteriori, and there seems to be an explanation there of necessity. Well, we can just talk about that one before I get the other one. I don't want to give you too much. So, do you think there are cases in which we can give explanations for why X is necessary, or do you think it's just we got to just go with it?
So, I mean, let's start with this case. So each thing is identical to itself. And you ask me, so why? I'm actually not sure what to say. Right, what would count as an explanation of self-identity? It feels to me like we're kind of at some kind of conceptual rock bottom at this point, and there's just nothing further to say. And I'm thinking, so I'll get to your cases in a minute. I'm thinking in mathematics too, there'll be some ground floor of maybe it's the Peano axioms, right? And if you ask me why, I'm just not going to, why is this one true? There'll be nothing informative that I can say, right? It just, so why does it have to be this way? Because that was the question. Why does it have to be that everything's self-identical? Why does it have to be that whatever, x plus y equals y plus x? Why does or whatever it is for any x and y. It feels plausible to me that there's going to be this ground level of claims for which there isn't anything interesting to say that explains why. There's kind of no metaphysics that goes along with this. Then there'll be lots of other claims. So in mathematics, this is most obviously true, that you can derive from the primitive ones. And then in a certain sense, there's an explanation. But it doesn't explain why they're necessary. It just shows that they are, because the necessity of this one follows from the necessity of these. But I never got around to explaining why these were necessary. Right? So it's in that sense that I don't think you can explain the necessity of mathematical claims, even though, of course, you can. I mean, if you show that this claim's a logical consequence of those, then given that these ones are necessarily true, it just follows that this one is. So,
Okay.
I started with self-identity because you mentioned the identity of names, so the Hesperus and Phosphorus thing.
Yeah.
Once you find out that Hesperus and Phosphorus are names for the same thing, then the metaphysics here is very simple, right? There's one thing that's identical to itself, right? And I already said I didn't think there was any further explanation to be given.
Right.
In the case of the kind of theoretical identifications, so that water's 2 parts hydrogen to 1 part oxygen, and we're supposing that it's necessary that water's 2 parts hydrogen to 1 part oxygen. I'm tempted to say much the same thing, right? There's only one kind of stuff here, and it's 2 parts hydrogen to 1 part oxygen, right? And it really is like the Hesperus, Phosphorus, and Venus case. We just didn't realize that there was just one thing, and that's what its nature is. And if you ask me, why is water 2 parts hydrogen to 1 part oxygen? I've kind of draw a blank on what I can possibly say, other than I can explain why we ended up with, we've got the word water, we've got the word H2O, they arose in different ways, but what there actually is just this one kind of stuff. That's what there is, right? And so we can only know these things a posteriori. That is the propositions, where we formulate the propositions in terms of Hesperus and Phosphorus and their identity, or water and water being 2 parts hydrogen to 1 part oxygen, because we couldn't figure out the essential properties of water a priori. That's why the proposition's only knowable a posteriori. So it's different from the mathematical case, where if you're smart enough, you already know whether Goldbach's conjecture is true.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I do. Yeah, it seems like a lot of that's also going to apply to like the rigid designation account. So that's interesting. And I think you did a good job with that. I realized after I said it, I did a pretty bad job of explaining what I was meaning there. I think the rigid designator case would have been better to stick with than. But I did want to ask that too about theoretical identifications and a posteriori with some of the Kripkean accounts, just because it seems like with Kripke we have some stories that are explaining or purporting to explain why X is necessary, as opposed to just saying that it is. But so what you said there covers that. But let me give the other one I was thinking of, and this one we already mentioned that you're skeptical of the capital G metaphysical grounding. So this might just be a non-starter for you, but Ricky Bliss has this example of some accounts people have given. So say if, in terms of explaining why there's necessity, so let me give this. So the way she put it is, if P is a necessary fact and Q is a necessary fact, then the conjunction P and Q is also necessary. And the conjunction P and Q being necessary is explained by this grounding relation. So P and Q is explained by P and by Q separately. So P and Q is explained by the proposition P and the proposition Q. So the necessity of the conjunction is explained by the individual necessity of the conjunct. So we have a grounding explanation for why this conjunction is necessary. So I don't know. I mean, again, that might just be a non-starter for you because of your kind of some of your doubts about grounding. But I just bring this up because I'm interested in what we can say about necessity explanatorily, if anything at all. So what do you think of that case? Is it just kind of
So I guess I want to say something similar to what I said about the maths case. So it's a logical consequence of P, Q separately, that P and Q, right? The conjunction's a logical consequence. If the conjunction is necessary, then kind of working backwards, the conjuncts are both necessary. If I ask why is the conjunction necessary, I'm thinking that a satisfactory answer is going to have to tell me why P is necessary and why Q is necessary. And then I figure this kind of is going to go the way that the mathematics case went, where you get back to, you've got this huge elaborate structure of claims that are necessary, but you'll come back to a small number of claims that are necessary, and their necessity is sufficient to generate by logical consequence the necessity of all the rest of them, but there's no explaining why the ones at the bottom are necessary. There's just nothing interesting to say. It's like down here at the bottom, we've got for any x and y, x is identical, for any x is identical to x, right? Now, explain that one to me. Why is it necessary? And you kind of, I don't know, it just feels like there's nothing to say. Right. So,
right?
I mean, I agree that it sounds like there's something to say in this case. If the necessity of P and Q is a logical necessity of jointly the necessity of P and the necessity of Q. But that doesn't mean that you've explained to me why it's necessary that P and Q, not in the sense of, my now understanding why it's necessary that P and Q, because you didn't tell me why it's necessary that P and you didn't tell me why it's necessary that Q. Now, there might be something that you worry about about explanation here, that I'm asking too much of explanation. You might think it's a bit of an explanation of the necessity of P and Q. And I guess I don't share that intuition, but maybe that's because I really mostly think about these questions in the context of comparing worldviews, so kind of big pictures, where you just kind of add up around the edges all the things that are primitive, right? And those are the things that really count as the commitments. And the things around the edge, like the things in the initial state and the boundary conditions, they can't have explanations because there's nothing to explain them in terms of.
Right. Okay.
So I'm thinking that, although it's kind of dangerous, but that kind of model is how I think about our conceptual resources generally. So there's going to be this stuff that's just absolutely primitive, and we don't. And
right. Okay.
And that's where explanation is going to end. And there are people. So Brian Lefto has this very big book on God and necessity, in which he tries to explain a whole lot of the things that go back beyond where I want to just rule a line and say, stop, we've reached the point where explanation makes sense. So, of course, there are lots of people who disagree with what I'm saying.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah, as we covered before, that's true of any philosopher saying anything. You go find a philosopher who disagrees. Yeah, okay. I wanted to say something else there, but I forget what it was. Yeah, no, that all sounds right to me. I have similar concerns about, the conjunction being explained by the parts we still haven't given account. Oh, this is the other thing I wanted to ask. So then on your view, is it the case that necessary facts are in a sense brute? And because the strong version of the principle of sufficient reason wants to say that even necessary facts have an explanation, usually grounded in further necessity. But the weaker version that, say, Alex Proust defends in his book just says that every contingent proposition has an explanation. Yeah. So it seems like that endorsement of that is compatible with thinking that necessary facts are brute. And if it seems like if you want to go that way too, or at least primitive, I guess one of the question is why prefer necessary explanations to contingent ones if we're going to get bruteness either way?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that, but let me say something about that first thing. So I think that it depends what we're talking about. Remember when we were talking about primitives, there were
Yeah.
ontological primitives, ideological primitives, and theoretical primitives. And the theoretical primitives were the axioms. So necessary claims that are entailed by other necessary claims will not be theoretical primitives, because logical consequence, everything that you get by logical consequence doesn't count against your theoretical primitives. And it doesn't look as though there's any cost in the ontology or ideology that goes along with a necessity claim. So what I want to say is they're not all brutes because they're not all primitives, right? Everything that you get by logical consequence is paid for properly in the
Okay.
axioms. So, for example, the necessity that it's necessary that P and Q, where it's necessary that P and necessary that Q, that it's necessary that P and Q is not going to be a primitive, right? Because if I just have necessary P and necessary Q, or at least it'll go one way or the other, depending how the axiomatization plays out. It won't be that all three of those things are primitives, right? Either one of them will be, or two of them will be.
Okay. Yeah. All right. That makes sense. Further on the other point I was mentioning, because Ricky Bliss has this argument actually from the PSR against metaphysical foundationalism. So, because when we're talking about, I mean, maybe there are some explanatory resources that necessary facts have that contingent ones don't. But one of the arguments she gives, she has a paper on this that just says, well, if you're going to say every proposition has an explanation, then you're going to have an infinite regress with each item being explained by, and it's just going to, I guess, almost kind of like a Humean. And of course, someone like Rasmussen or Proust is going to want to say that doesn't explain the plurality. But she says that if you're going to endorse the principle of sufficient reason, you can't have a foundation because it's going to have no explanation. So I don't know if I buy that, but I think it is an interesting question that, like, why would we, even if we are going to have a finite model, causally finite, why have that initial part be necessary? Like, what explanatory advantage? And
So,
I guess there are
so,
a couple.
so on the question about what to prefer, primitive necessity or primitive contingency, this comes back to the question about whether you want to minimize the possibilities that you've got or whether you want to minimize the necessities that you've got.
Yeah.
Because if it's contingent, then you've got to have some more possibilities. So if you think the laws are contingent, then you've got to think that they could have been some range of other ways. If you think the initial conditions are contingent, you've got to think they could have been some range of other ways. And that gives you a whole lot more possibilities. If you think that it's virtuous to limit the possibilities, though not virtuous to collapse all the way down to Leibniz's one world, then there's this kind of interesting trade-off. And I actually I'm not familiar with stuff that's really good on this, on the why you should go one way rather than the other. My hunch is that you want to keep your possibilities small, and you don't mind too much if you have some brute necessities.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. That makes sense. That's good. Man, so there's more we could go into there, but I want to get into some other facts. Of course, I'll kind of speed run some of these because I don't want to keep you too long. But yeah, man, there's so much to go through there. But I mean, there's other facts. We've talked a lot about kind of some, I guess, general cosmological facts, right? So whether it be contingency or the finitude of the universe itself, or just the cosmic fine tuning, whether it be constants or biological fine tuning, it seems like naturalists have at least as good explanations, definitely at like a modal metaphysical level. So there's not really yet any reason to prefer theism. So let's talk a little bit, just briefly, again, I'll speed through this. So kind of the three M's in explanation would be like minds, meaning, and morality. So you think minds are latent local, And I think that's a position that any physicalist about the mind is gonna be perfectly comfortable with. In fact, probably have to be committed to. So, but you and Rasmussen already
Well, not
talked.
quite though, because I mean, it depends what you. If by minds you mean something is developed as what mammals have, then maybe yes. But if you just mean proto
Right,
consciousness, then you'll get people like Chalmers who are at least open to the idea that mind is kind of universal.
right.
Even quarks
Yeah,
have, I mean, in some sense.
yeah. I guess even or if you have a view on which like animal consciousness, like animals are sufficiently non-human animals are sufficiently developed to have consciousness even at early stages.
So, although that will still be late though, because
Yeah. Well,
that's
yeah.
still
Late
third
in overall
generation
history.
stars. It's late in the history of the universe.
Exactly. Yeah, it's true.
And my view is that consciousness goes a good way down into the
Hmm.
animal kingdom.
Yeah. Rather, because I mean, we could spend probably an hour just talking about that. I mean, I guess I'd just instead of going too much more into that, I'd refer you to refer any viewers to the discussion you had with Josh Rasmussen earlier on the channel, where you guys went a little bit in depth because he thinks you have to have fundamental mind and you don't. So you had a good dialogue about that. Um, and so because we've talked a little bit before about one of my preferred solutions to this, which is just to say you don't have to have the resources for building minds, whatever that may mean, at the initial state of reality. You just have to have it at some point, and we can tell a pretty causally consistent and a pretty plausible account on which. And I've had some further thoughts on this after reading Dan Dennett's book on Darwin and his
Yep.
chapter called Threads of Actuality in Design Space, about how we have branching biological possibilities. If we take consciousness to be a biological possibility, there are chances that play out that make it possible, and it's only possible contingently. So there's only a certain way that chances could have played out that could have given us sufficient neural activity to get consciousness. So um, yeah, there's a lot more to be said there, but I think there's consistent stories to tell, at least causally. I don't know, did you, because we talked about this a little before over email, but do you have any more thoughts on that, the account of.
So that sounds right to me. I mean, I'm reluctant to make too many hypotheses about what's
Right.
possible, but uh, it doesn't sound ridiculous to me that there are other possible worlds that last as long as this one does and they're kind of as big as this one is with the diversity of stars, but consciousness just doesn't appear anywhere. It doesn't. I mean, a bit cautious because we don't quite know for sure how widespread
Right.
consciousness is in the
Yeah.
galaxy, for example. But on the assumption that it's not very widespread, then that wouldn't be a very bold hypothesis that it was possible that we didn't get it, which is the line that you were just giving to Dennett, that it could easily have played out. Certainly that we didn't get it on Earth, but maybe that we didn't get it anywhere.
Right. Yeah. And it could have been, located in different places or not at all.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's definitely a story naturalists can tell because, again, I just don't see, because, well, Rasmussen and Leon in their book agreed that there has to be some fundamentality to mind, whether it be God's mind or proto mental properties. And I don't know, I guess the line I said earlier is just how I think about it. We have to have the resource to explain mind somewhere, but there seems to be a causally consistent story we can tell where that's not built into the foundation. But
Sure. So that's definitely my view.
okay, yeah, right. And we talked a little bit about I think before, like higher order potentialities. So the initial state may have the potential to produce something that could have minds, but it doesn't have to have the potential itself. So that's just a taste of that view. Again, I'd refer you to the Rasmussen conversation. You guys did a good touch on that. As far as meaning and morality, I mean, these arguments don't strike me quite as serious as the cosmological arguments. I don't know why. I mean, most of the moral arguments are shifting towards like moral knowledge arguments, that only on theism do we have predictions about us being able to have moral knowledge. And I've never really fully understood the line that says on naturalism there's no meaning. And I'm not sure what the explanatory role between God and meaning is supposed to be. I mean, there's the classic story of if we found out we were being bred by aliens for food, well, we have a purpose that's instantiated by a higher consciousness, technically, but does that make our lives more meaningful? I mean, no. And of course, maybe that's not exactly the same as the God case, because God presumably doesn't want to eat us, unless he's Kronos or something from. But Yeah, so I've not really gotten the meaning stuff as much, but you also give, I don't know if you want to briefly explain the line you take in your book that with meaning and morality, naturalists are just as open to, say, an Aristotelian account of intrinsic value that theists are. Because one common line is that, you're alive now, everything you do is not going to matter in like 1,000 years because you'll be dead. In reality, you'll move on. So your life can't have any meaning unless you exist forever or something does. So this is a common thing you hear from people who, I don't know.
So one thing that I haven't tried out, I think, yet, is a kind of spatial version of that argument. Your life can't have any meaning now because nobody in any other galaxy knows about it. That just seems absolutely weird as an argument. But then what's the difference about, people not knowing about us in far distant future and in far distant galaxies and people not knowing about us in the far distant future, right? The argument seems just as lame in the second case as it does in the first to me. So I guess I really just don't have this intuition at all.
Yeah, I don't either. I don't really get where it comes from. I guess it strikes me almost as more of a knee-jerk thing. People are just like, "Oh, you're an atheist. You must have no meaning in your life." And I don't get where that line comes from.
Sure, but that's a whole different thing because, this having meaning in your life is about the relationships that you have with your friends and family and things like that. And it's obvious that that having it or lacking it kind of pays no attention to whether you're a theist or an atheist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so usually the charge moves pretty quickly to, what's missing is this big narrative in which you're a star player, you're an important part of the grand battle between good and evil or something like that. And I'm quite happy not to be part of that, right? I'm happy with the meaning that I get out of the things that really matter to me, friends, family, that kind of thing, projects that are worth doing, and so on. And I take the other point that I made earlier about whether, off in distant galaxies, they know what I'm doing is irrelevant to all of that stuff, right? What matters is what's happening here and now for the meaning that really matters. And the far distant future can look after itself.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't know if we have time to go into things like moral knowledge, but non-theists tend to want to take this line on more generally that naturalists can't account for reliable cognitive faculties or moral knowledge because of evolution. This is kind of Plantinga's line, and to some extent, when I think about this, I just think it doesn't take mental externalism about mental content into account quite enough for my taste. But
so that would be one thing, but another thing is that there's this really weird skeptical element to the kind of when Plantinga gives his evolutionary argument against naturalism, that he treats minds kind of the way that logical behaviorists did. And so it's not surprising that he comes up with the conclusions that he ends up with. It seems to me pretty obvious that anything that's a product of evolution that's in the kinds of environments that it grew up to be suited to is going to reliably represent portions of its environment because it won't survive if it doesn't. You have to be able to accurately represent the predators and the food and stuff like that. Now, we moved a bit beyond that because we're a social species and we develop large brains it was a sort of backwards and forwards between our sociality and being able to deal with it, because sociality requires being able to recognize friends and foes within your kinship group as well as outside. And so it's not surprising that we've got skills that we're very good at accurately representing what other people are feeling and what they think and a whole lot of stuff like that. And once you've got that far, it's not hard to build mathematical and moral reasoning on top of the reasoning that we're able to make about what very complicated critters around us are going to do, right? So we're probably going to be accurate at lots of things like that, including a decent amount of moral reasoning and mathematical reasoning. And I mean, the way that I think about this, you can kind of read back from the facts. Basically, we agree on the maths and we agree on most of the morals too. Of course, there's kind of more margin in the moral case. There are cases where we disagree, but there's lots of basic principles that we're agreed on. And I can't remember whether I discussed this one in the book that you showed before or not, but it's a kind of fundamental principle that you shouldn't kill except when you're allowed to. And then there's a small number of cases and we disagree about what the excluded cases are. We agree on some of them. Almost everyone agrees you can kill in self-defense if there's no other option, that you can kill defending kith and kin if there's no other option, or, you know, if it's reasonable for you to think that you've got no other option or something like that. Some of us think you can kill animals. I mean, excluding the cases where obviously you can, because you can kill in self-defense,
Right,
defending, and so on. For sport, for example, other of us are kind of inclined to think that's not right. Right? There's disagreement about the exact range of killing, but by and large, we agree that the default position is that you shouldn't do it.
Okay, yeah.
And other principles go the same way. And it's hard to imagine a society that didn't have default rules like that. You shouldn't lie except when you really have to, because sometimes you do, like the axe murderer says, "Where's Joe? I'm going to chop him up." And you say, well, he went that way when he went the other way. And then it seems like, contrary to what Kant said, you did the right thing, because, you know, we're actually mostly pretty good at making those kinds of judgments.
Yeah.
But then there are some areas where we're terrible. Some things we're really bad at. Philosophy is one of them. Politics is another. And religion is a third one. And we can tell we're terrible because of the disagreement. I mean, and Plantinga just mushes this all together and thinks that we have to think that we're reliable about everything, and that naturalists have to say we're reliable about nothing, right? And both parts of that are just wrong.
Yeah, I think so too. That's a good line of response. Man, yeah, there's more we could go into there. As I said, one of my worries with it that I've heard, that I've found as a pretty big problem, is it focuses so much on, you know, naturalism producing our cognitive faculties just as like isolated, as opposed to having part of their content as external objects. So, like, you know, Putnam's twin earth argument, and we seem to have good reason to think some of our mental content is external, and to that, you know, that seems to be something that doesn't really factor into the argument. But there could be
so
more.
That would be consistent with the story that I was telling.
Right,
too.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah,
because it's not just us. All the way down the kind of chain to quite primitive organisms with a few hundred neurons, there's accurate representation of some stuff about their environment going on, and they're making choices, right? So, you know, it might be so the frog sitting on the lily pad, and Plantinga's story is a fly flows in, sort of comes into the visual field of the frog, and it just automatically, the tongue goes out, and it's a very straightforward mechanism. But in fact, the frog has various competing imperatives: mating, sleeping, eating, and so on, and it has to make decisions between them, right? And it's just not as straightforward as the kind of simple stimulus response story that Plantinga wants to tell, even about the frog, never mind about us.
Okay, yeah, for sure.
So that's what I meant when I said, you know, he's got this really kind of primitive view about mind, at least when he's foisting it on to naturalists.
Yeah, that's the thing I found interesting, because Plantinga's account is a more externalist one about, you know, justified beliefs and things. But then when he talks about this argument, it seems to that goes away. But I think that's some good. So there's a lot more that could be said about that. But in interest of respecting your time, I'll just speed through just one of the last things I wanted to go through In your book, The Best Argument Against God, the general, which I'd recommend everybody to read. We've covered a lot of good stuff here, but still read the book. The general line of argument you give is that we compare the theories up and we look at the data, and naturalism and theism, they can both explain the data equally well, and we should just prefer naturalism because it's simpler, barring something it can't explain that theism can. So if we accept, even though I agree, I wanted to ask you if that's the only route you like to take, or are there some things you think naturalism perhaps can even explain better? A couple ideas I have. So I think of like Paul Draper's arguments. I'm sympathetic to the idea that naturalism predicts just the process of biological evolution better. It predicts the process of evolutionary suffering in creatures better. And then another one is one that you and I talked about in our last conversation, of an advantage naturalism may have. Well, part of it is this perfection argument with like God. Reality is imperfect. How do we get from perfection to imperfection? And one reason that seems to be convincing to me is naturalism gives us a more monist view of causal reality. We just have, in terms of causal reality, we just have this natural stuff, and that's all that causal reality is. So we have this monistic view. It's nice and clean, and we have like causal closure. So we have this kind of like nice, neat package. Whereas on theism, we have kind of this more, at least on some theistic views, unless you're like a pantheist, we have more of a radical separation of God and his creation, such that it's dependent. So naturalism gives us a more kind of a neater looking picture, so as long as it can explain things. So I wonder if you think there are some good reasons to prefer naturalism other than simplicity, or you think the explanation just completely balances out.
Right. So, I mean, what you were saying was partly just appealing to simplicity, right? It's a neater picture,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So what I think is that you don't need it. Like if you're trying to construct an argument, it's sufficient if naturalism at least breaks even everywhere. And so in the book, from memory, it's a while since I've thought about what's in it. I think there are places where I say you might think that naturalism's doing better here, but we don't need that for the purposes of the overall case that I'm constructing. I suspect that on the kind of distribution of goods and evils, naturalism probably actually does a bit better than theism. So that's related to a different argument of Paul Draper's.
Yeah.
Right. So I suspect that he might be right about that, but it doesn't, for the purposes of the argument in the book, it doesn't matter. Right. All we need is at least it's a draw.
Okay. Yeah.
If not a win. And so so then there's no point in that book in trying to push for something stronger. And in general, I'm not interested in doing that because there's not really much point in arguing that you do something better in some little arena. That's part of my overall method, is to say you've got to the only thing that's interesting, the only interesting game in town is the big picture. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that.
So, and of course, I also am quite happy to allow that you can disagree with my assessment of the big picture. I'm just saying that it should look awfully reasonable. I mean, you should think, look, you could reasonably see it all this way, the way the naturalist does. Right. I'm happy for you to say, look, actually, I think there are these various points where theism's doing a bit better. I'm not so sure that theism really isn't about as simple. And so, judgment, theism might actually be slightly ahead. I'm happy to allow that people can decide that way. That's just not how it seems to me. And I would like to have an example that other people who kind of grew up like I did could look at and think, oh, okay, so yeah, that kind of makes sense of a lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. That would be the kind of ambition for the book. That's who I'm really writing the book for, that kind of
right. Okay. Yeah, because you could even perhaps grant that naturalism, even if you were to grant that naturalism doesn't have the simplicity advantage and they balance out completely, the point is to show, naturalists have this very coherent picture. And, I personally think just at a metaphysical level, there's a lot of kind of explanatory power and predictive success in just the broader naturalist metaphysics. But yeah, that all seems right, though, that just like, it's not, of course, it's not necessary to your argument. I think the strength of that argument is that it gives theism a lot. It says, yes, theism can and does explain all this at least as well as naturalism, but, naturalism still comes out on top because of just how we compare theories and how in the virtues that theories have.
So I didn't press on the perfection problem, which I admit I still find very puzzling. Right, and there's other things depending what else you believe. If you believe in eternal damnation, that really doesn't seem good to me. That just makes God a monster as far as I can see it, because he really didn't have to make those people in the first place. If he knew that's how it was going to turn out, it's not looking good. Right, and so on. But yeah, as far as the argument goes, I'm not going to push on any of those.
Yeah, that's fair. So it would be part of a separate case to maybe give some advantages to naturalism that may be there, but of course for this one, all you need is the simplicity. So that's great. Okay, well, we covered a lot of ground here. We could cover a lot more, but we don't have, unfortunately, for time constraints. I'll let you go here because I know it's late for you. But thank you so much for being willing to come on so late and for so long and to talk about this stuff. It's been really interesting, and it's always great having you on. Cameron, when you had your recent interview on Capturing Christianity, I think it was with Bill Craig, Cameron said something about it being your 5th time on Capturing Christianity, and I was watching that and I was like, well, okay, I got to beat Cameron. I got to get Graham on again, just to beat his numbers. So yes, just all that to say, thanks again. This is really interesting. It was fun to talk about some of just the general, philosophy of explanation as well as all this data. To fill the case out more, anybody, definitely get yourself a copy of Graham's book. It's great. And thanks again. It's good to have you as always.
Okay, no worries. I'll see you later.
All right, let's see.